My name is David Matheson, and I've been fascinated by the myths since I was a young child. I've also been fascinated by the stars and constellations. Even as a young boy, my father took me out and helped me find the constellations using the outlines of H.A. Rey. I had the opportunity to teach the myths at the United States Military Academy at West Point. I had the opportunity to teach the Odyssey and to meet the late great Professor Fagles, who translated my favorite English translation of the Odyssey. For the past 15 plus years, I have been studying the connections between the myths and the stars, and I am convinced that around the world, the ancient myths are built on a shared system of celestial metaphor in which the actual gods and goddesses, kings and princesses and queens in the stories correspond directly to constellations using a common system where specific constellations have specific qualities and characteristics around the world. Cultures that are not supposed to be connected according to the conventional paradigm, but are. Many of you are familiar with the overwhelming archaeological evidence that more and more is being found around the world and pointing to connections of cultures that, according to the conventional paradigm, should not be connected. And the ancient worldwide system of myth and its common celestial foundation around the world constitutes yet another tremendously important and powerful body of evidence showing the existence of some predecessor civilization, some predecessor culture that the most ancient civilizations and cultures that we know of seem to have been inheritors of this system. But unless we can see how these constellations relate to specific figures in the myths, then we can't see that tremendous body of evidence in this ancient worldwide system of mythology connected to the stars. Unfortunately, we haven't been taught the constellations. I'm going to show a few. Some of these I've shown before, some of these I haven't, that give just powerful evidence of an ancient worldwide system connecting cultures that the conventional paradigm says cannot possibly be connected. And yet these connections that I'm going to show are not coincidence. They're not something that I am just making up. I'm going to show you a little bit, starting with one that I have talked about a lot, and that is the constellation Hercules and the connections to rain and thunder and wind gods around the world, starting with the familiar figure of Zeus of ancient Greece. Zeus was the god of the sky, the ruler of Olympus. He was the thunder god. He had the thunderbolt, the lightning bolt. His thunderbolt was this powerful weapon. And in ancient artwork, Zeus is depicted in this distinctive posture that lines up with the outline of the constellation Hercules. This vase, it depicts Zeus holding this thunderbolt here, and his name is inscribed on the vase itself, and he's fighting against a adversary known as Typhon. We'll talk a little bit about the importance of Typhon, but some of the paint has peeled off and flecked away. We will fill that in. I'm not just making this up. There are illustrators who have illustrated this. Here's a drawing that you can find on Wikipedia Commons showing Zeus fighting Typhon from this ancient vase, and you can see that Zeus is in this deep lunging posture, brandishing the thunderbolt overhead and then reaching out with his other arm. Well, that posture corresponds very clearly and very closely to the outline of the constellation Hercules. This is the constellation Hercules. Notice the raised heel on Zeus. Notice the raised heel on the constellation. The extended rear leg and then the deep lunging forward leg, they're identical. We also see brandishing a powerful weapon overhead, brandishing a powerful weapon overhead. Note that the head of Hercules, the constellation in the sky, is very square, like a man with a full beard. Zeus is depicted with a full beard. He also has this forward arm outstretched. That corresponds to the arm of Hercules in the heavens. You might ask, why is Zeus reaching out to touch Typhon in this ancient vase? It's because the constellation Hercules itself in the heavens reaches out its arm. Now, don't get confused by the fact that the constellation is called Hercules. The constellation has that name, but it plays many different figures in the myths. This constellation does play the role of the hero Heracles, who is a son of Zeus as well. Hercules or Heracles is also depicted in this same posture, and instead of wielding a thunderbolt, he's usually wielding a club or sometimes a sword, and you can see why that is. But let's focus on this vase, and Zeus has his arm out. That corresponds to the actual outline of the constellation of Hercules. Now, in the myth, Zeus was using his powerful thunderbolt weapon against Typhon, but he was unable to stop Typhon. Typhon was this one adversary who could not be killed with thunderbolts. Who could Zeus be throwing thunderbolts at in the sky? Well, there's several constellations nearby, but just below Hercules in the sky is another constellation, not as familiar to many people, but this constellation is known as Ophiuchus. It has a central body, and the name Ophiuchus means serpent holder because the central body is flanked on either side with, it looks like it's holding a large serpent or two halves of a large serpent. The tail is on the left as we're looking at it. That's actually the east side of the central body. And the head is on the right side as we're looking at it. That's actually the west side in the heavens. But you can see the central body with the two serpent halves. That constellation is known as the serpent bearer Ophiuchus. Comes from a Greek word for a serpent. Now, in the vase, I'm arguing that that is Typhon. So Zeus fights Typhon because Hercules is directly above Ophiuchus, and he's hurling his thunderbolts at Ophiuchus. And if you take away the rather faint lower legs of the constellation, you can see why in the vase and in the myths themselves, we don't have to look at the artwork. We can actually go to ancient texts and see different descriptions, but I like to use the artwork because it's very powerful evidence and it's very visual. Typhon has this torso, this central torso, and then at the waist, from the waist down, he has two serpent legs. Well, that's because he is associated with Ophiuchus. If we take away the faint lower feet of the constellation, you can see how Ophiuchus itself could be envisioned as a central torso with two serpent legs on either side. Here's the two serpent halves of Ophiuchus. Like I said, the part that I've labeled 1, that's the serpent's tail. The part that I've labeled 2, that is typically thought of as the serpent's head. So when I refer to the serpent's tail or the serpent's head, now you know which side I'm talking about. But in the myth of Typhon and in the imagery of Typhon, his upper body ends at the waist, and then he's got these two serpent legs. Here's his two serpent legs, 1 and 2, and they're coming out of the torso, and you can see how Ophiuchus could be envisioned as a creature with serpentine lower half and human torso in the upper half, and that's exactly how Typhon is envisioned. Now, sometimes Ophiuchus figures are also winged, and that's because of the serpent half, particularly serpent half number 1 there, the serpent's tail, sometimes appears as wings on Ophiuchus figures. But let's just focus on figures that have an upper body or head of a human and the lower body of serpent. And I'm going to show that that is associated with Ophiuchus very often in myths around the world, starting here with Typhon, the adversary of Zeus. Now, there are depictions of mermaids. This is obviously much later than the ancient vase that I'm showing. This is a illustration, a woodcut illustration of a mermaid from the 1500s. But notice how she has two tails. She's got a human torso and then two tails coming out, just like Typhon. And notice how her arms are portrayed in this woodcut. The arm on, here's tail number 1. That corresponds to the serpent's tail half of Ophiuchus, number 1 on that side. Look at how the arm is depicted as fairly high up on that tail. And then on the other side, that would be the tail number 2, or serpent half number 2. The arm goes all the way down to the thigh, corresponding to Ophiuchus in the sky. This is further evidence that there's this pattern around the world of figures that have serpentine, or in this case, fish tails coming out from a torso, are associated with the constellation Ophiuchus. Now, you may be familiar with Starbucks coffee. The mermaid there has two tails. A lot of times we see a mermaid with one tail, but in the Starbucks logo, it's two tails, and she's wearing a crown. Just above Ophiuchus, just above the serpent's head, is a crown in the sky. That's known as the Corona Borealis, or the Northern Crown. That constellation is situated just in front of Hercules and above the serpent's head of Ophiuchus. And that's an important constellation that we'll come back to, that crown, the Northern Crown. So sometimes figures associated with Ophiuchus will also have something to do with the crown, and you'll also see that figures associated with Hercules will sometimes be reaching out and grasping something that's associated with the Northern Crown. So just keep that in mind. There's a couple other things I want to point out on Zeus. Quickly, he's wearing this shawl, and the shawl ends in two little tails over here. And this is important because there's another constellation on the other side of Hercules from the Northern Crown that's known as Lyra, and the name means the lyre. A lyre is a small harp. It's like a miniature harp that is a musical instrument. It's a stringed instrument, and as you can see from the outline in the sky, Lyra actually has two little strings, or two little stars that could be envisioned as forming the strings inside of a harp-shaped outline. It also has a very bright star known as Vega. That's the fifth brightest fixed star in the sky. It's a very bright northerly star, Vega. So this is important because it will show, I'll show you some patterns that we see around the world that are not just coincidence. This is a common system. In the case of Zeus, his shawl, the long tail, seems to be pointing towards Lyra, the position of Lyra in the sky. And in fact, those two little tails could line up with the two little strings of Lyra. This is from an ancient Sumerian cylinder seal. It's a cylinder that has artwork carved into it, and when you roll it out in clay, it leaves an impression in the clay and shows you the artwork. And in this particular cylinder seal, there's a depiction of a god named Enki, a Sumerian god, who is approaching a standing figure. And notice how Enki is portrayed. Again, we've got a human torso down to the waist, and then serpent coils. In this case, it's not twin tails, but it's a very coiled serpentine figure. And I have argued and given lots of evidence in some of my books, such as my 2019 book, The Ancient Worldwide System, that Enki is associated with Ophiuchus. In the ancient myths of Sumer, which is one of the oldest civilizations acknowledged by conventional history, there's a myth of a flood that is sent by Enlil. Enlil is a god who's associated with winds and storms. That's Hercules again. Enlil is going to send this flood, and when he announces it to all the gods, Enki sneaks out to go tell one upright mortal man, Ziusudra. Later, he's in Babylonian. There's other Noah-like figures. He's going to tell this Ziusudra, or in the Mesopotamian later cultures, the Babylonian and Akkadian figure's name is Utnapishtim, and you can see that na sound. Utna is related to the later figure of Noah in the biblical scriptures. But you can see here Enki is telling Ziusudra, watch out, there's going to be a flood, you need to start building an ark. Okay? So this is from a Sumerian cylinder seal. It's very ancient, but Enki, I've argued, and there's other evidence that we can bring in, but just based on what we've already seen from Typhon, you can see how Enki is associated with Ophiuchus. And he goes and tells Ziusudra about the oncoming flood. Here's another piece of evidence that supports the association of Enki with Ophiuchus. Look at in this cylinder seal, Enki is holding some kind of a egg-shaped object, or a small oblong kind of oval object. That is associated with the upraised, that upraised hand, that is associated with the serpent's head in the constellation of Ophiuchus, I would argue. This is another detail in the ancient artwork, this very ancient cylinder seal, that matches up with a feature in the constellation Ophiuchus. And I've said Enki is associated with Ophiuchus. And look, in some depictions of Enki, he has this serpent body below the waist. Let me show another ancient cylinder seal. This is also Enki talking, we think, to Ziusudra, but in this case, he again has this human torso, but below the waist, it turns into the coils of a serpent, Ophiuchus. And here again, we have a very clear detail in the ancient Sumerian cylinder seal that associates Enki with Ophiuchus. In the artwork itself, look at the bent arm. In the V above that bent arm of Enki, just above the V of his bent arm, there's this 8-pointed star, this sunburst or starburst figure above the outstretched arm, just above basically the V in the arm. I show images in some of my books over and over of figures who have, Ophiuchus figures who have their arm out like this, and there's a whirling sun disk or a heavenly sun disk. Some images from ancient Egypt, some images from ancient Mesopotamia, other cultures, where that whirling disk is also associated with Hercules. Now, the outline of Hercules, as we saw, has this deep lunging posture, square-shaped head, but I argue that there is another outline of Hercules that is used in some of the ancient myths. It's like a version 2 of the way to outline Hercules. That's very important, and I talk about it at length in some of my books, but let me show it to you. It uses that central square-shaped head. It uses that square-shaped head as a central disc, and then spinning off of that, you could connect the stars in a different way to where it's a central disc with 4 arms spinning off of it, just like we've got this 8-pointed star, and it's directly above the serpent's head side of Ophiuchus. If that is an extended arm coming out of Ophiuchus, the deep bend of the elbow, the spinning form of Hercules is just above the bend in the elbow. Now, I also argue this is where that ancient symbol of the swastika comes from. It's not from the Big Dipper. If you look on like Instagram, you see people saying, oh, it comes from the Big Dipper as it rotates around the pole star Polaris. I can show you lots of evidence. The swastika actually comes from the spinning disc of Hercules. It's this whirlwind. And figures associated with Hercules, such as Zeus and Enlil, the god of wind, the god of the sky storms, like Zeus, a thunder god, a wind god. This spinning disc of Hercules is associated with a divine wind or a hurricane wind, a whirling wind. That is the disc form of Hercules. And look how it's just in the correct position above the arm of Ophiuchus to show us from these ancient Sumerian cylinder seals that Enki is associated with Ophiuchus and the serpent coming out from the bottom of the torso. Why is this important? Because we find these patterns around the world. Before I leave the Sumerian cylinder seals, just opposite from that 8-pointed star, we also have this kind of crescent-shaped disc. Now, the correspondence is perhaps a little less positive in this case, but I would argue that that crescent-shaped image in the Sumerian cylinder seal is probably associated with the Northern Crown. So I'll just point out the Northern Crown one more time. Very important constellation that we'll talk about a little bit more. The figure on the other side, seated like that with an extended arm, is probably associated with the constellation Virgo, but I'm not going to draw it in because I'm focusing right now on Hercules and Ophiuchus, and the connection is not quite as positive, but pretty likely. Now, let's continue on to other parts of the world that are not supposed to be connected in any way to ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Sumer. And here in the Americas, in Central America, this is a beautiful cup. I've shown this cup before. It's a very important piece of artwork. When I saw this, I immediately realized that this imagery is based on the same constellation as other rain and sky gods around the world. This is an ancient Maya cup depicting the god Chahk. Sometimes his name is spelled this way. He is a Maya rain god. This beautiful cup today is found in the Met Museum in New York City, and it has been dated to the 7th or 8th century AD. So it is well before Columbus, and this is a rain god who is in the same outline as the sky god Zeus, and also associated with Enlil of ancient Mesopotamia, the rain and wind god who brings the flood. Now look at the outline of Chahk. Look at his posture, and you can see how he is in the exact same posture as the constellation Hercules. He's got his deep lunge. His legs and body posture line up perfectly with the outline of Hercules. He's brandishing a weapon over his back. In this case, it's an axe. The axe is pointing downward instead of upwards towards his head, but you can see it's the same, brandishing a weapon with one arm, and in the other arm, he's reaching out in front of him. And what's Chahk doing in this Maya vessel? He's grasping something. He's grasping a disc. What could that disc be? Well, archaeologists and art historians, they don't know what that disc is, but I do. It's the Northern Crown. He's grasping a disc because Hercules' figures can be envisioned as reaching out with that forward arm and grasping the Northern Crown. You just have to imagine one more line going from his outstretched arm up to the disc. And if you put the stars there, you can see the disc itself in the artwork lines up very well with the Northern Crown, almost identical. I haven't altered these outlines at all. This is straight out of the planetarium app Stellarium. That's the outline of the constellation Hercules, and in front of the constellation Hercules, the Northern Crown. So this is not just coincidence. This is not just, well, people when they lunge, that's the way their body looks. This artwork is part of an ancient system in which sky and rain gods are often associated with the constellation Hercules, and sky and rain gods are often associated with a powerful weapon such as the thunderbolt or the axe of Chahk. You can think of the hammer of Thor. He's also associated with this Hercules constellation in the sky. And remember how I pointed out the constellation Lyra on the other side from Hercules on the side above the hip of Hercules? Well, in this artwork itself, Chahk has this long sash with a little tuft at the end, just like Zeus was wearing this long shawl with two tails at the end. That is connecting to the constellation Lyra. Lyra has these two strings on it, but Lyra also has the very bright star Vega, and in this case, Hercules figures will often have a sash that has a tuft at the end or a ball at the end, or sometimes there'll be a scabbard for a sword with a ball at the end of the scabbard, lining up with the position of the star Vega, or indicating a connection to the star Vega. This shows beyond any doubt that Chahk, this outline of Chahk, is connected to the heavens, the constellations Hercules and Corona Borealis, or the Northern Crown, and Lyra, the lyre with its bright star Vega. They are incorporated in this ancient artwork from the Maya. They're incorporated in the ancient artwork from ancient Greece, and I could show you other examples from around the world. I could show you examples from ancient Japan. I could show this over and over and over. This is an ancient worldwide system in which specific figures are associated with specific constellations, and their characteristics are shared. Sky gods, rain gods, powerful weapons. The same characteristics are shared across cultures. This is not just coincidence. These cultures are almost certainly inheritors of a very ancient system. Now, before we leave the Maya artwork, this beautiful artwork is from a site known as Yaxchilan. Yaxchilan is a Maya site with beautiful stone temples and these lintels that are carved in beautiful artwork, and this is known as Lintel 15. As you can see in Lintel 15, we have a serpent figure that has a human head and human torso down to a serpent body, just like Ophiuchus, just like other Ophiuchus images from other cultures around the world. There's actually writing on this lintel, and the inscriptions tell us this is the image of the holy woman, Lady Six Stone, Lady Bakab. On 4 Qwak 12 Sip, the water lily serpent is conjured. He is the Nagual of Ka'awi. Now, what's going on in this image is Lady Six Stone, Lady Bakab, is on the right. She's in the lower right corner of the image, and she's conjuring up a water lily serpent, or the water lily serpent. And we are told in the inscription that this water lily serpent is the Nagual of a god who's known as God K to scholars, or God Ka'awil. So this god has a Nagual. Nagual means like our higher self, our divine self, our Atman. But Nagual also means the whole universe, like Brahman. In ancient India, there are texts that say Atman is Brahman, Brahman is all. Well, in the Maya text here, it says that this god, God K, Kahwil, has a Nahual that is the water lily serpent. So we each have a higher self, a Nahual, in Maya understanding. This is his Nahual, and it's exactly correspondent to the images that we saw of Enki, who is clearly associated with Ophiuchus. So in the ancient Maya imagery, we are seeing imagery that corresponds to the heavens, but not just that, corresponds to a system that was in use in ancient Sumer. Ancient Sumer, the most ancient civilization acknowledged by many academics. And Enki is associated with Ophiuchus. I'm quite confident in telling you that water lily serpent, who's being conjured here by the holy woman probably corresponds to the constellation Sagittarius, either that or Virgo. Those are on either side of Ophiuchus, and they both play female figures quite often in the myths. Sometimes they play male figures. All the different constellations play both male and female figures, including Ophiuchus, including Hercules. But this scene of the holy woman conjuring the water lily serpent, who's a Nagual, is very important and clearly corresponds right back to the images we saw of Enki talking to Ziusudra, or Enki talking to a seated figure who probably corresponds to Virgo. So maybe Lady Sixstone corresponds to Virgo. She has kind of some plumes coming out of her headdress. That's a characteristic of Sagittarius, but we won't get too into that. What I want to point out is that we can be very confident that the water lily serpent is associated with Ophiuchus, and that this pattern is identical to what we see in cylinder seals from ancient Sumer. This is a worldwide system, and I'm not suggesting that the Sumerians had contact with the Maya. I believe it is far more likely that these civilizations inherited an older system from a predecessor culture. But unless you understand the constellations and how they relate to the gods and figures in the myths, you'll miss all of this evidence. It's very powerful evidence. And in fact, let's keep in mind that name of Nagual as we look at some other evidence from around the world. Ancient India, some of the most ancient texts of ancient India, again, one of the most ancient civilizations acknowledged by the conventional paradigm. Here's an image of Vishnu dreaming the universe into existence while sleeping on the back of the Shesha Nag. The Shesha Nag is this multi-headed serpent. The word is spelled Naga or Na. It's pronounced Naga or Nag. Very interesting. Nagual and Nag are almost linguistically identical. I don't know if that's just a coincidence, but it's very interesting. I believe that all these civilizations, even the most ancient civilizations that we know of, are inheritors of an older system. I could go through this entire image and this entire story of Vishnu and the Sheshanag with Lakshmi at his feet and show the correspondences to specific constellations. This is all celestial. This is based on the celestial system. In ancient China, there is a goddess whose name is Nagual or Nuhua. Just like Nagual, just like Naga. It's very fascinating. Again, that may be coincidental. It may not. But Nuhua is a serpent entity. She has a human head and a serpent's body. And again, I would argue that that is clear evidence of a connection to Ophiuchus. So around the world, we see this system connecting cultures that are not supposed to be connected. And I've just shown a few pieces of evidence here. I could go around the world. I could show you evidence from ancient Japan. I could show you evidence from Africa and the cultures of Africa and their myths and stories, as well as the myths and traditions of cultures from the Aboriginal indigenous people of Australia, from the Norse myths, from the myths of the Druids and other European cultures prior to their traditions being stamped out by Christianity, from North America, the Native Americans of North America and their stories. I've done a whole series where I was working with the 5 nations, 6 nations of the Iroquois, talking about their creation stories and looking at connections to the stars. This is a worldwide phenomenon. In fact, across the vast Pacific, the Polynesian cultures that stretch from all the way from Aotearoa, New Zealand, to Hawaii, down to Rapa Nui, the Polynesian cultures of the Pacific that are spread over the largest area of any culture group on Earth. Their stories are also based on this system, and I have shown that. I can show that with numerous examples and pieces of evidence. This evidence is overwhelming that we are dealing with a worldwide system where the correspondences and the characteristics of the constellations stay the same around the globe. The most ancient civilizations that we know of are already using this system in their earliest artwork and in their myths, which indicates that it is almost certainly an inheritance from some culture far more ancient than even the most ancient cultures that are acknowledged by the conventional historians of today. We've already talked about the concept of Nagual, the higher self or the divine self. This is found in the myths around the world. We see twins, for instance, in myths around the world, often a divine twin and a mortal twin, such as Castor and Pollux in the myths of ancient Rome, or Castor and Polydeuces in ancient Greece. But we find twins and twinning in myths around the world. Gilgamesh and Enki are described as basically being twins. It's a way of depicting for us or dramatizing for us the existence of a Nagual, a higher self, an Atman that we have access to. Modern psychologists basically teach that our unconscious is like an iceberg that's below the surface. Our conscious mind is just the little tip of the iceberg. Something like 10 to 13% of who we are is our conscious mind. The rest is unconscious. And the unconscious is dramatized for us in the myths. They teach us how to access and connect to all that wisdom of our unconscious. But those who don't want us to have access to that, those who want to keep us basically asleep or hypnotized or brainwashed, don't want us to have access to that very powerful information. I'll close this video here and we can continue this discussion, but I wanted to share some of that evidence today. Thanks so much for watching.